Hello everyone. I would like to welcome you all to SPEX CertiPrep's webinar on analysis of pet food for inorganic contaminants. I'm Peter Esco, Marketing and Communications Manager here at SPEX CertiPrep, and I will be moderating today. Before we begin, I'd like to get a few housekeeping items out of the way. First off, everyone who registered for the webinar will be sent a copy of the presentation slides. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel so that you may watch it at your convenience. We will be uploading it there in about a week or so. You will receive a follow-up email with a link when it's available. Any questions you may have will be answered at the end during our Q&A session. Simply type them into the question box as you think of them, and time permitting, we will answer as many as we can. Be sure to hang around after the Q&A session because we're raffling off one very cool gift. With that out of the way, let's get on with today's presentation. I would like to introduce Patricia Atkins. Patty is our Product Application Specialist and has worked on a number of research projects here that you may have already seen, including our BPA and phthalates in water white paper and webinar, and the Chemical Gourmet, a webinar series on the chemistry of chocolate, salt, and other gourmet foods. She's now working on a research project analyzing trace metals in lipstick, which we will be presenting later this year. Patty, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, and welcome to our afternoon session of our Metals and Pet Food webinar. First, I would like to dedicate this webinar to the employees of SPEX CertiPrep and SPEX SamplePrep and their pets who graciously donated their food to our experiments. Well, SPEX CertiPrep and SPEX SamplePrep, when we look for interesting projects to focus on, we usually ask the employees what they want us to study. It might be a water bottle, it might be chocolate, and in this case, we are a company of pet owners and pet food consumers, and they wanted to know what was in their pet food. So why should we study pet food? Pet food is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year business, and even in economic downturns, we see that consumer spending on pet-related products actually increases. And most industrialized countries spend millions, if not billions, of dollars on pet food. About 1.6 billion pounds are spent in the UK on pet food, about $14 billion here in the US, and the leading exporters of pet food are France with almost $993 million, the United States at $780 million, and then the Netherlands about $500 million. While the leading importers of pet food are Japan at about $700 million, Germany at about $600 million, and the UK at also about $600 million. So before I started looking into pet food, I really didn't know a lot about the history of pet food. I did know from family history that my great-grandparents and my grandparents really didn't feed their pet food. So I was just really interested on how this whole concept of canned and dry pet food came about. And before the late 1800s or the early 1900s, commercial pet food really did not exist. And the first commercial pet foods were canned foods. The first pet food brand was Kennel Ration brand, and it started to be introduced after World War II in response to there being a surplus of horse meat. After World War II, consumers of human food companies actually saw a way to use their human food byproducts to produce pet food, and the revenues were about $200 million a year. After 1956, there was an introduction of dry food into the pet food market, and in the 1980s, we started to see specialized diets for ailments such as obesity and diabetes and kidney disease. And of course, the newest trends over the past decade have been all-natural and holistic foods. Well, the whole pet food industry was rocked and came to this big momentous year in 2007. It was a really big year in pet food for a lot of reasons. The pet food industry reported sales worldwide of over $45 billion, and they were also rocked by massive recalls, which affected many different brands, many different companies, dog food, cat food, and other foods. And it was all surrounding pet deaths caused by melamine and cyanuric acid. These two compounds were found to be counterfeit protein sources from Asian suppliers. If we look at why so many brands were affected, if we assume that there's about 200 brands of cat and dog food, and this number could be much smaller or much larger, if we look at it, about 80 to 90% of the pet food business is controlled, at least here in the U.S., by 4 conglomerates. So they have 80 to 90% of those 200 brands, with between 10 and 20% being small independent brands. Well, these 4 conglomerates and some of the smaller brands, they actually use other manufacturers to manufacture their pet food recipes, where they send their recipes to these large pet food manufacturers, and then the recipes are manufactured for them. Out of the pet food manufacturers that work for these different conglomerates and small companies, there is one manufacturer who actually makes a very large proportion of the brands, about a little less than 50% of the brands. And they do manufacture pet food for a variety of different companies and different brands. But 2007 wasn't the only list of recalls for pet food. The FDA actually publishes lists of pet food recalls. And when I looked on the FDA website not too long ago, there were over 1,000 entries for pet food recalls in this list. So 2007 brought a pet food awareness to most consumers. We wanted to know, what are the quality of pet food ingredients? What do phrases like not fit for human consumption mean? We also started hearing things like organic, premium brands, all natural, quality, and we have pet foods claiming to be the highest quality of ingredients and products. But we're not really seeing any data to support why these particular ingredients are high quality, and we haven't seen any data on the potential toxicity of these. So we start to look at, here in the U.S., who governs the pet food industry. Well, FDA is one of the bodies that actually does regulate the pet food industry, and under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, they require that pet food be safe to eat, produced under sanitary conditions, free of harmful substances, and truthfully labeled. For canned pet food, they require that it be free of viable microorganisms. Now, there are a large amount of additives and ingredients which are generally regarded as safe, GRAS, and these need no pre-market approval or requirement to be in pet food. There's also labeling regulations which require that the product be identified, that a quantity statement be on the label, the name and the place of business of the company producing it, a listing of all the ingredients from most to least by weight, ingredient standards and definitions, and nutritional and ingredient information. So when we were looking at trying to find samples of pet food, we tried to look at the label and look at all of these different factors in gathering a nice widespread group of samples. We looked at the pet food labels at first. We looked at the ingredients. We wanted to know what the first 5 ingredients were. What was the highest percent? Was there any information on the source of these ingredients? Was there any nutritional value information printed on the label? What was the cost of it? And if we were able to, we would look into consumer web groups and websites and different rating websites to see if there was any consumer feedback on the quality or the source of ingredients or the additives. We wanted to make sure we got a wide range of different types of samples. And some of the things that we started to notice on pet food labels, and especially on some of the pet food advocacy websites, is there's some ingredients that are considered to be very controversial. Whether they're controversial or not, I guess, depends on the consumer. But there are some things that did cause some discussion. There were any animal source products where animal is not specified. These things are called animal fat, animal meal, which is animal tissue that's in ground, animal digest, which is hydrolyzed animal tissue, and any animal or meat byproducts, which are the non-rendered other than meat parts from slaughtered animals. Then we have byproducts, all the byproducts that are parts other than meat. We have bone meal, which is ground animal bone. We have fillers and fiber sources like gluten and brands. And then we have preservatives. One of the preservatives that is on a pet food label would be BHA or BHT. They're banned for use in the EU, but they're still allowed in the U.S. And there has been some documentation suggesting possible link to tumors or possible human carcinogens. And we also have selenium compounds. Selenium compounds in the past few years have been linked to the overdose and death of racehorses. There was a controversy a few years ago about excess selenium being given to racehorses to combat muscle fatigue. And you'll have synthetic vitamin K, which is also considered to be a controversial ingredient. It was never tested for pet food use, and it was banned in human food in Europe and in human supplements by the FDA. Then we started looking at what do the labels say about the nutritional value of the pet food? We took a look at cat food and dog food to see if there were any differences in the packaging. Dog food, we were expecting dog foods to have meat and carbohydrate sources because dogs are omnivores, so there should be meat and carbohydrate sources. Cats, we were expecting to actually see more protein sources, more meat sources, because they're obligate carnivores. We also saw on these labels a lot of non-digestible fillers or fibers like corn gluten, cornmeal, wheat middlings, ground white rice, wheat germs. So there's a whole variety of these wheat and corn products that we found on pet food labels. We look at two generic pet food labels. One is a cat food and one is a dog food label, and in all honesty, I don't remember which is which anymore. But if you look at the two labels, in many ways they're virtually identical. They have a lot of the same common ingredients, ground yellow corn, byproducts, bone meals, animal fat, animal digest. So I did not see, at least in these particular labels, any real differences between the cat and the dog foods. Okay, contaminants and additives. These are things you might not see in a label but are potentially in pet food. You have propylgallate. It's an antioxidant used to stabilize cosmetics, food packaging, and items that contain fat. And it has been debated to be a suspected carcinogen. And you have bisphenol A and phthalates, which are plasticizers and can liners. There's been a lot of talk about bisphenol A and phthalates over the past few years. And these compounds have actually been banned from children's products in many countries around the world. And we have the cause of the 2007 pet deaths in the U.S., and there was later some deaths of infants in China from adulterated infant formula with the melamine and ceranic acid. We also have ethoxyquin, which is a preservative for mostly fish and seafood products. It is under some controversy. It's a suspected potential carcinogen. Then there was a study done with the FDA that found very small amounts of pentobarbital, which is a euthanasia drug, in some of the pet foods. You also can find things like veterinary drugs, antibiotics, growth drugs, antiparasitic drugs that are given to feed and stock animals. And there's also pesticide residues, molds, fungus, mycotoxins, and physical contaminants, anything that can actually fall into the processing and become a contaminant in the final product. And what we were concerned about is, what about the metals and the elemental composition? And you really do not see most metals reported on a pet food nutritional label. You'll find some of the macro elements, especially if they have a nutritional value. But some of the trace metals and the other things which we might be concerned as contaminants are not found on the packaging label. After 2007, suppliers really started to sit up and take notice of where their manufacturer and raw materials were coming from. Prior to 2007, there was not a lot of information to be found on the country of origin or the source of the raw materials for the manufacturers. After 2007, manufacturers were called upon to really re-examine their supply chains and to really go through the supply chains and be accountable for where these raw materials and these products were coming from. And it is true for any product, the more it's processed, the less real control one has over the finished product, the more potential for contamination. So when we looked to the ASPCA for potentially toxic agents that we should focus on for our study, we found a list of toxic agents listed by the ASPCA, and the website is actually at the bottom of the slide. We were concerned about things like iron, arsenic, cadmium, copper, zinc, mercury, and lead. And those are definitely elements of concern for animals as well. So with these questions in mind, we decided to make some questions for our study. The first one being, what level of trace metals, if any, was in our samples? And what type of contamination? Was it heavy metals? Was it toxic metals? Was it something that was harmless? And then, in particular, if we had a fish sample or seafood sample, seafood flavors, did they actually have higher mercury levels because of the known association of mercury in seafood? Were there different levels present in dog food versus cat food? And since more cat food flavors are fish flavors, would there be more mercury in those particular samples? Were there differences in the levels of metals present in wet versus dry food? Potentially cans could be made out of things like aluminum, tin, there could be some chrome there could be some lead solder. Do we have any higher levels of these canning metals in the canned food versus the dry food? And did the presence of some of the more controversial or questionable ingredients or lower quality ingredients affect the levels of heavy metals or toxic elements? And was there a correlation between the cost or the amount that you paid for the food with the amount of contamination? If you were buying a much higher priced food, was it guaranteeing you a lower level of contamination, at least when it came to the metals? So what we had were 59 pet food samples donated by SPEX CertiPrep and sample prep employees. And then those were supplemented with purchases of pet food from local New Jersey supermarkets, some chain stores, budget stores, some dollar stores, and pet supply stores. We also had 3 human canned proteins, sardine, tuna, and chicken, which we ran alongside the pet food samples for comparison. We had a fairly good breakdown of wet and dry foods. We had 31 dry food samples with 18 dog food samples and 13 dry cat food samples. We had 27 wet food samples with 13 wet dog food and 14 wet cat food samples. We tried to have a range of ingredients and different ratings, so from premium to less expensive and dollar store kind of brands. For the dry food, we had 12 to 16 grams of dry pet food ground to a uniform powder using SPEX CertiPrep's freezer mill under cryogenic conditions. So the sample, 12 to 16 grams of sample were put into the freezer mill with a polycarbonate vial, so there were no metal parts touching the sample, and they were put into a cryogenic liquid nitrogen bath, and they were ground to a very fine uniform powder, and there's an operating program. The wet food samples, the wet pet foods were homogenized in a blender, and the entire can was homogenized into a blender with a smooth consistency. And if the sample was unable to be completely homogenized at first, we measured 10 millialiquots of water, and we added them to the sample until the sample was blended smooth, and later the weight of the water was subtracted from the sample weight. All these samples were tested as served and not by dry weight basis. So we did not dry the wet food out to a powder in order to test it. We tested it as served, like you would serve your own animal. The samples were then digested in microwave vessels, 1 gram of sample with 10 mils of high purity nitric acid, and we do have a microwave program here for anyone who's interested. We did run vessel blanks prior to the sample digestion to make sure there was no carryover between the samples. And after the samples were digested, they were diluted between 250 and 1,000 times before running on ICP or ICP-MS. We have here the list of the instrument conditions for our ICP-MS DRC and our ICP-MS. We did use an ICP OES to run the macro elements. We also did look for some of the trace metals, but in many cases where the trace metals fell below detection limit, we had to run them by ICP-MS in order to see those trace metals. We just look at the macro elements first. We have things like selenium, aluminum, sodium, potassium, many other of these macro elements. There was a very large variability amongst the different food. If we look at some of the max and min of these foods, for calcium we had a low of about 500 ppm, and we have into the 16,000 range here of a high. So there was a lot of variability between the different foods for all the different elements. There was not a lot of consistency from sample to sample. If we look at selenium, which is one of those elements of concern, in many cases, the pet food manufacturers, if they add selenium to their product, will list concentration on the packaging. And in the cases where the packaging did contain a selenium level, we did find that the amount of selenium we found was very close to the stated level on the package. We were also looking at things like zinc, because there have been some reports of zinc toxicity in animals for overexposure to zinc. And the zinc varied greatly as well, from about 10 ppm to almost 300 ppm. We look at a snapshot, and this is not meant to be read, this slide. This is more of a visual aid. We tried to divide the foods up into the dry foods here in the area of blue, and the wet food areas in the area of green here, with cat food being this light blue, dog food being a dark blue, a light green being wet cat food, and a dark green being wet dog food. And we just went through our results, and we color-coded our results to the higher the concentration, the darker the color. We see that a lot of the darker colors all fall within this dry food range. Again, this is not dried weight. This is the total concentration as served. And with the difference between the cat and the dry, you see more of the dog dry food having some higher results than in the cat dry food. If we look at a snapshot of these toxic trace elements, we see, again, a very large variability. In some cases, there were non-detectable amounts of a particular element, and in other cases, we go from a very small amount, thorium of 0.06, to a high of almost 87. Some of the elements of concern, we were looking at some of these elements, 11 out of 17, had high ppb or low ppm levels. We had 6 ppm of nickel in one sample, and we had 9 ppm of tin in another sample, as well as 1 ppm of uranium. And we found that when we looked at the human food samples tended to have lower concentrations of most of these toxic trace metals than in the pet food. We look at our heavy metals present. For greater than 1 ppm, we found chromium and lead, and from half to 1 ppm, we saw cobalt and antimony. One of the more unexpected results we found was that 6 of our dry dog foods actually contain more than 250 ppb of uranium. Now, looking at the packages for these 6, we were trying to find was there any particular common denominators. And the only even slight common denominator we found that all 6 of these contain some sort of corn product, and not necessarily the same corn product. So it could have been, corn meal in one and another corn product in another. But we were just looking for some commonality, and this is the only one we did find. Out of the 6 of the samples that did have uranium, we found that 4 out of 6 of them had greater than 500 ppb, and 1 sample had close to 1 ppm. When we looked at the uranium, we also decided to look at the beryllium and thorium levels. And the beryllium levels are the orange little diamonds, and the thorium levels are this dashed green line and the green squares. We decided to see if there was a correlation between the increased levels of uranium and increased levels of beryllium and thorium. And while it's not a perfect correlation by any means, there is a strong correlation that the higher samples with the higher uranium levels also had some higher beryllium and thorium levels. And we also wanted to look at the canned food versus dry food for the packaging metals. And this, in particular, we're looking at aluminum here, chromium, and tin. And you would expect that maybe in a canned food package you would find more of these metals than in a dry dog food packaging. But actually the reverse was true. You had higher levels of these packaging metals in the dry dog food and lower amounts in the wet dog food. And this particular line is for aluminum. If we look at chromium for cat food, again we find the same trend where the dry food was just higher than the cat food overall. So one of the questions we said, well, what does this mean? We went looking for documented levels for dogs and cats for limits of heavy metals, and we were not able to reliably find levels for dogs and cats. We did find some various references in veterinary texts and veterinary guides to levels, and they could range everything from mice to farm animals. There were not a lot of definitive levels for dogs and cats. So what we decided to do was to look at the human EPA and World Health Organization guidelines for heavy metals and use those guidelines as kind of a benchmark of where our results were taking us. So the results were calculated on the weight of samples, and we used some assumptions here when trying to calculate serving sizes in the average animal. In talking with the different dog owners here at the company, we standardized dry dog food to about 5 cups a day maximum of about 500 grams, wet dog food about a can or 375 grams. Dry cat food would be maxed about 1 cup at 100 grams, and wet cat food would be about 1 large can or 175 grams. And also just to have some sort of benchmark to work off of, we said the average weight of a cat would be about 10 pounds and the average weight of a dog would be 50 pounds. And we fully are aware that 5 cups of food could be an awful lot of food to feed a small dog, or 50 pounds does not cover every dog. This was just a way of us setting some ground in order to compare things. So we looked at the reference dosage for the EPA and the tolerable daily intake for the World Health Organization. And these are the definitions for the reference dosage and the TDI. And it's basically an estimate of daily exposure to the human population that's likely to be without an appreciable risk of deleterious effects during a lifetime. And they're expressed in units of milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day. So what does this calculate out to? We went to the EPA's website and through the EPA's literature, and we started to collect limits. And I should say, in regards to the EPA and to the World Health Organization, they're constantly reviewing the limits for human exposure. So these numbers do change. In fact, when I first started looking into the limits for the EPA and the World Health Organization, at the beginning of last year, and just to try to update this presentation at the end of 2010, I found that some of these levels had been lowered or changed or had been pulled back for review. So if you want the most accurate information of the EPA and the World Health Organization limits, you should go to the EPA or the World Health Organization websites and check the limits yourself. But as of the last time I checked, which is towards the end of 2010, these were the most accurate limits I was able to find. Now for dogs, we took those limits and we calculated them to 50 pounds of body weight. And we did the same with the World Health Organization. And then what we did is we looked at our results, calculated to our 5 cups of food, and we tried to see if there was an excess of any of the particular elements. If we were going to feed this particular 50-pound dog 5 cups of food, would they exceed the EPA or WHO limits? And all of the colored results exceed the EPA or WHO limits in some way. Again, the darker the colors, the more it exceeds. So the yellow would be up to 5 times, so between 1 and 5 times the limit, or 1.5 and 5 times the limit, so under 5 times the limit. Orange would be under 10 times the limit, red about 20, purple about 30, and black above 50. We do see that some of the elements do exceed the EPA or the WHO limit. We have one result for antimony here, which is very high, which is 50 times the limit. We have another one here, which is 30 times the limit. We have some higher arsenic results, which could possibly be due to some ICP-MS interferences. Then we also have some cadmium limits, some nickel, a few mercury limits that also exceed the limits. And we do have our uranium, which exceed, in some cases, the 5 or the 10 time limit. We look individually at the EPA and WHO limits compared to what we found. Again, we find the EPA and the WHO limits to be here in the yellow and red for cadmium, and that there are quite a few samples that would be higher than the EPA or the WHO limit, basis on 5 cups and this 50-pound body weight. For the uranium, here are 6 samples which had more than 250 ppb of contamination, and the EPA and the WHO limits are here around the 10 and the 50 range here. For lead, we had 1 sample that was particularly high in lead, and the rest of the samples basically met the EPA limit or, EPA, the WHO limit, or were below the WHO limit. We also have thallium, where there were quite a few results that exceeded the thallium limit. Antimony, we had 1 or 2 results that were significantly over the WHO limit, and then the EPA limit, which is quite a bit lower, has a few more samples that would exceed that limit. Mercury, we had a few samples that went over the EPA or the WHO limits as well. Now, I put beryllium on this slide for one reason. The EPA, when they quote their limit for beryllium, use a study from the 70s which showed beryllium being added to beryllium-enriched dog food being fed to dogs in order to establish a beryllium exposure limit. And this beryllium caused gastrointestinal distress and lesions and other problems for the dogs it was fed to when it's fed at a high level. So while none of these particular foods did exceed the beryllium level, there is some thought about if it did not do a deleterious effect over a lifetime, would there still be some sickness or some illness caused to a higher beryllium level? If we look at our wet dog food, especially compared to our dry dog food, there are less of these shaded or high results. We do have one very high result right here for very high tin results. If we look for cats, again we have our EPA and WHO limits and calculated for 10 pounds of body weight for a cat. If we look at the dry cat food results, we do find that there are some results that would be of concern or be worth some more investigation. We have a very high lead result here. We have a few high antimony results as well. Again, we have some high arsenic results which would have to be followed up upon a little bit more. And we have a few results. We have one uranium result which would approach 5 times the limit, and that's more because of the size of the cat and the serving size. We do look at a graphical representation of some of these results. We do see that some of there's one mercury result that actually does exceed quite a bit this WHO result. We have some cadmium results that are above our EPA and WHO limits. And we have some high nickel results in quite a few of our samples. We have a very high lead result, and we have one uranium result which would, like I said, exceed the EPA and the WHO limits for uranium, but did not exceed the 250 ppb total concentration that we were talking about. If we look at wet cat food, there are some more higher results. The effect of the concentration of the metals are more apparent when a smaller animal is seen in a 1-cup serving. We do have some tin results. We have one tin result here that is a little high, and we do have cadmium and a few mercury results. Overall, what did we find? Was there a difference in the level of metals present in dog food versus cat food? We did find that dry dog food had higher toxic metals than the dry cat food overall as samples, including the 6 samples that had uranium that ranged from 500 to 1,000 ppb. We had cat foods that was served that had some higher impact of concentrations of arsenic and tin and cadmium. And we had the highest lead in a dry cat food at 6 ppm as tested. Did we find that foods with fish or fish flavoring had higher mercury? We didn't find any evidence that there was higher fish content had high mercury content. And when we were looking for the difference in level of metals present in wet versus dry food, we did find that some of the higher levels of tin were in canned food. The highest level was in a canned dog food. But the highest levels of like aluminum were found in dry food, and the highest lead levels were also found in dry food. So there was no real clear correlation that potential canning metals were higher in the canned food rather than the dry food. Did the presence of questionable ingredients or lower quality ingredients affect the levels of heavy metal and toxic elements? We found toxic element exposure in all price ranges, in all ranges of quality and ratings of foods. We did find that some elements like tin and lead were found generally in some of the lower rated or the cheaper foods, but there's no real clear correlation, and a lot more samples would have to be taken into consideration to really draw some correlations on contamination. So one of the questions that our employees ask is how you go about finding a good food for your pet. And the answer is just like you would have for your own food: read the labels, know what your controversial ingredients are, know, if you can, find out the sources of the ingredients of your pet food, and when in doubt, consult your vet. And we also had a few employees who suggested that they just are going to make their own pet food so they know what they can put in it. I'd like to thank all the employees of SPEX CertiPrep and Sample Prep and their pets for the donations of their food. I'd like to thank the ICP and ICP-MS chemists that conducted the ICP and ICP-MS analysis, Laszlo Urnier and Bill Driscoll, and I'd like to thank Dick Boswick for the sample preparation. As we said before, this is not a study of all the potential contaminants found in pet food. These were a random amount of samples that were tested, and we're looking at them as snapshots of the potential overall toxic elements that could be consumed by pets. This was a small study with a small number of samples, and in order to make any definitive judgments as to where these elements would be coming from, a larger study would need to be undertaken. And we're not making any medical or veterinary claims to any hazardous natures of any particular compound or pet food. Now I think we have some questions.
All right, Patty, thank you very much. Excellent job. We've got lots of great questions here, so let's dive right in.
Okay, we have a question about chromium speciation, including the characterization of trace metals and various methods. What methodology was used to measure chrome-6 if it was speciated as separate valence state from chrome-3? That's actually a very good question, and something I had meant to cover and I had actually forgotten during the presentation. Some of the EPA and the WHO requirements are very specific for the particular toxic element form that they're regulating. In mercury and methylmercury is actually the form that is looked at, and for chromium it is chrome-6. And what we did was total chromium, so it was not speciated for the chrome-6. A further study would have to do some speciations. Like I said, we were more looking at the snapshots than the individual component balances. When discussing regulations and guidelines, no mention was made of AFCO. Please discuss. AFCO is actually, they don't make the regulations. They make suggestions for the definitions. It's very clear according to their website that they do not make regulations. So I was not really trying to speak towards an organization. I was more discussing the regulation that's being controlled by a government agency. Is there an effort to standardize labeling of pet foods with respect to trace metals? I'm not sure of this question. That would be something that maybe the FDA or some other governing body might be willing to address. As far as I know, and this is my own personal research, and it's probably the same research that any interested pet owner would do, I haven't seen any suggestion other than pet food advocacy groups to standardize some trace metal analysis for labels. Okay. We have a question. Any ideas how nuclear waste appeared in pet food tested? Do you think it could be due to the practice of using sewage sludge in agriculture? SPEX CertiPrep never ever said that there was nuclear waste in pet food. What we did find were the presence of 3 elements which have been used in the past for nuclear energy and for energy production. These are naturally occurring elements. They can be found in uranium or beryllium-rich soils. They could be found in areas. They could be found in mining runoff. They could be found in a multitude of different ways. And there's no way to trace how these particular elements got into the pet food. It could be that the region that the raw materials were grown in happened to be naturally abundant in things like uranium and beryllium. So I can't even speculate where some of these sources, and we're not going to try to speculate on where some of the sources of these trace contaminants came from. The only thing we were looking to see if they were there. It would be up to a much more senior governing group to try to decide where the potential sources of contamination for pet food would be and how they would regulate that. I'd like to know which of the elements could be a source of concern to pet consumers with young children who might come in physical contact with contaminated pet food. As an example, salmonella has recently been found as a contaminant and a source of possible transmission to young children who might handle pet food and might even put it in their mouths. As we said before, we're not vets. We did not find any veterinary documentation to what elements may be potentially hazardous to pets. As far as if there's transmission concerns, I would treat pet food like any other substance that you're not sure your children should be eating and keep it locked away from them. There is no list that I could give you of potentially harmful elements. We do know that for humans, the heavy metals are of particular concern. But if you have concerns about which elements or what elemental exposure you should be concerned with for your pet and for your children, you should speak to your physician and your veterinarian. Which specific EPA and WHO guidelines were used for the interpretation? Water, food, please give citation. You can actually go to the EPA website, and they do have profiles of each potential contaminant, whether it be tetraethyl lead, it be methylmercury, it be chrome-6, and you can find the different levels for ingestion for food and water, for air exposure. In general, we used food exposure when there was a level for food exposure. If there was no level for food exposure, we used water exposure. We never used inhalation exposure for the levels that we found. And if you want to look for the actual citations, you can go to the EPA website and exactly what I did is to the toxic net and type in each particular element and find the exact parameters that they limit. So we have a follow-up to our Chrome 6 question. The reason for the question on Chrome 6 is there's literature reports in the last several years that indicate significant Chrome 6 in the hundreds of milligrams per kilogram range in yeast products such as brewer's yeast, common dog supplement. That was very interesting to know. I hadn't found that particular citation. And yes, it should be clarified that in most cases what we're talking about in our study are total amounts, total mercury, total chromium. So a fraction of that could be Chrome 6 or it could not be Chrome 6. You would definitely have to have another agency. We are a standards manufacturer, and the projects that we take on are on a small scale because we have an interest in what's in our food, our drinking water, our makeup. And we think these are interesting topics to investigate. So we do small studies to raise a little awareness and a little interest. And if anybody comes forward from a bigger agency who wants to continue and make this a full scope testing, then we encourage that. Was the food donated in unopened packages? Yes and no. We did have some food that was donated in unopened packages. We did have a lot of food that was donated as open, so they brought in a sample of their food. When they did sample their food, we did have some guidelines on what we would like. We wanted to make sure if they were bringing in samples of food, we asked them if it had been sitting in a metal secondary container of any kind to please not donate the food. We asked them not to use metal scoops or things like that if they were going to take a sample of the food. So, and we did not test for any bacterial or fungal contamination, so we weren't particularly concerned about too much cross-contamination. And with the wet food, in regards to the wet food, all the wet food was actually sealed and unopened. Will the results be published in a peer-reviewed journal? If yes, which one? If no, why not? We have discussed submitting it to a peer-reviewed journal. It is, as many know, published in Spectroscopy. The second part will be coming out this month. It has been decided that we'll write some sort of white paper for this particular topic. At this time, we do not have plans to send it to a peer-reviewed journal. We do recognize the limitations and the shortcomings of this study, and this is what it is. It's a short study. It does not have enough samples to really qualify into a large-scale peer-reviewed journal. We just don't have the time or the funding to do a multi-year study of the particular pet food. Do you have trouble with interferences when analyzing the ICP-MS, and what did you do about them? Yes, any ICP-MS spectroscopist knows that you do have potential interferences. We did what was possible to minimize them by using substitute lines, if possible. If more than one line that was free of interferences existed, we tried doing that. If some of our results were suspect, we did do standard addition to try to ascertain whether those results were valid or not. We did have an ICP-MS DRC system, which we used in order to try to reduce the interferences there. Some interferences are inherent in ICP-MS, and some of them, that's one of the reasons why we were looking at the arsenic levels and some of the mercury levels, and we're trying to do that with a critical eye because there is a possibility for some interferences. You noted 3 fillers, cornmeal, corn gluten, soybean meal, which are not digestible. Can you describe which nutrients are not digestible in the process you used to make this claim? I personally did not make this claim. This was a claim that I found in different veterinary texts and from different online sources, that cornmeal, corn gluten meal, soybean meal, other carbohydrate meal or these kind of crop meals are fibers and essentially undigestible by quite a few mammals. So this was not necessarily my interpretation of being undigestible, but something that I interpreted from other sources.
All right. For the giveaway, just a couple of things. First off, SPEX CertiPrep is now the proud distributor of the book The Elements by Theodore Gray. We're selling the book and the flashcard set, and Patty actually found this for us. And it's a beautiful hardcover book with photos of all of the elements, and it's just a great resource for basically anybody who's interested in chemistry. And also, we have our new catalog coming out in a couple of weeks. It's actually just going to the printer this week, so it's the same flip book design that you've all liked, and you're able to find all the information that you want. Only this time we have some new products. There are new consumer safety lines in there, plus new standards for ICP-MS and new PCB congeners. And if anybody is going to be at PitCon, then please stop by our booth. We're going to be in booths 2234 and 2235. Say hi to us there. And you can connect with us on any of your favorite social media sites. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. All of our videos, including the recording of this video, will be posted on our YouTube channel. Generally about a week or so from now, you'll be able to log in. All right, and I think that's we got a couple more. All right, so thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Patty, for giving a great presentation. And as a reminder, we will be sending everyone a copy of the slides. If not later today, then certainly by tomorrow you'll get a link to download them. And in about a week or so, a recording will be posted on YouTube. We'll also send out an email to let you know when you can watch it. So anyone who's interested in any of our previous webinars, including the BPA and phthalates in water, chemical gourmet, or the clean lab techniques, just go right to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/SPECCertiprep, and you can see all of them right now. And be sure to visit our own new website at SPECCSP.com. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you again in a future webinar. Thank you.